You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. So sometimes I'll pull a card before an episode to kind of ground me, or sometimes I'll pull a card to help me decide what to explore on the podcast that day. And today I ended up pulling the Ace of Cups, which made me think of a question that I asked for one of the daily prompts in my membership community that was actually based on a card pull. And the question was, what actually deserves my emotional investment? And so I thought, okay, we're talking about emotional investment today, but then I wanted to pull another card just to help support the Ace of Cups. And I ended up pulling the King of Cups reversed. And so I don't intentionally read reversals because I read every aspect of a card, regardless of how it's pulled anyways. But sometimes when a card emerges reversed, I feel like it does add a specific layer of depth. And in that moment, I thought about the price that we pay when our emotional investment is not reciprocated, or when it's invested maybe in the wrong place or with the wrong people. And then the negative ramifications that has on our own well-being and our growth. So that's kind of a little background intro onto why we're talking about what we're talking about today on the podcast. So if you've been listening for a while or you follow my work, you know that I am more of a psychodynamic therapist. And one of the most important ideas in psychodynamic theory as it relates to relationships is that relationships are never just about the present moment. We don't enter into relationships as a blank canvas. We bring lots of baggage, lots of unconscious expectations, desires, longings, childhood narratives and adaptations, and other just kind of emotional stories and experiences to the table. And something that I tend to talk about a lot in session and with couples is we don't just choose someone because we are attracted to them or we like being around them or they're mentally stimulating. Sure, all of those components exist, but we end up choosing emotional experiences that feel recognizable. So we're kind of unconsciously gravitating towards behavioral or emotional patterns in people that are familiar to us on some level. And this is why someone can repeatedly find themselves emotionally investing in unavailable partners or investing in inconsistent friendships or trying so hard with emotionally immature family members or sticking it out in impossible workplaces or finding themselves in relationships where they're just the perpetual caretaker. And I mean, disclaimer, I'm talking about this topic specifically through the lens of attachment, emotional wounds, emotional investment. So I understand even saying things like, staying in a specific relationship or a job could come from a privileged mindset. So I'm not talking about it through the lens of, oh, just leave. I understand things are not that simple. So keep that in mind as we are exploring this topic together. We're specifically just looking at it through the lens of why we emotionally invest in the people or places that we emotionally invest in. So, and what's interesting is from an outside perspective, seeing someone who is stuck in a cycle or a situation that is not reciprocal can be incredibly frustrating. I think many of us have been in that situation where we've either been the person stuck in an unhealthy cycle or have loved someone who is stuck in an unhealthy cycle. And It's frustrating because we're viewing it objectively and rationally, but they're experiencing it based on unconscious motivations and emotional wounds. And so, to kind of expand on what I was saying earlier, when we enter in relationships, there's a tendency to recreate these unresolved emotional wounds or unresolved emotional dynamics with the hope that maybe this time things will be different. And this is why there's so much projecting in relationships and why relationships function like a mirror. So an example of this is maybe as a child, someone never felt chosen. So then they spend their entire adulthood trying to earn love from emotionally unavailable people so that they can finally heal the wound of that left them feeling so unimportant. Or the person whose feelings were consistently minimized may become someone who constantly over-explains themselves to people who have no interest or no desire in trying to understand them or really even know them. Or maybe the partner who learned that to love required self-sacrifice and to love was to be a perpetual caretaker. In this case, that person might start to confuse feeling drained and depleted with love. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, I just have such bad luck with dating, or I have bad luck with friendships, or, bad luck with, certain people. And yeah, maybe some of that might exist, but it's often some sort of unconscious attempt to heal an old wound. So I think this is where the King of Cups reversed comes into play. We often imagine emotional maturity, which is one of the characteristics we apply to this card as, someone who has, access to lots of feelings, knows how to regulate all of those feelings, and is then also able to hold space for the feelings of others without becoming dysregulated. But I think more importantly, emotional maturity is measured by where we decide to share those emotions, who we let into our emotional space, and when we allow ourselves to step into the space of others. Because the regulated King of Cups can feel deeply without becoming emotionally flooded and remains connected to themselves while still being able to remain connected to others. Where from a reverse standpoint, the dysregulated King of Cups kind of organizes their own identity or their own behavior around someone else's behavior, or organizes their own moods around somebody else's moods. And then you eventually lose yourself. So recently on Instagram, I spoke about how I think the King of Cups is actually tarot's greatest lesson in identity. And I think that holds true here too, because reverse the King of Cups represents us when we allow other people's experiences to kind of infiltrate our own, and or their approval determines maybe our level of confidence or self-worth or value, or whether or not their consistency or lack thereof determines whether or not we feel safe, secure, or content. So again, reversed and dysregulated and lack of identity is more about outsourcing our own emotional regulation to other people, and outsourcing our emotional regulation to other people specifically who don't value us or maybe are not in the space to help us figure out how to organize or regulate that because they're dysregulated. And speaking about identity through the lens of the King of Cups reminds me of one of my favorite therapists, Esther Perel, who I don't think I've talked about her in forever. I used to talk about her all the time, but she often speaks about how relationships are places where we work to negotiate closeness without losing ourselves. And I think that balance is really delicate because when we think about relationships and we think about some level of emotional intimacy, there's naturally this vulnerability that exists. And there's naturally this experience of exploring other people and kind of like trying things on, what fits, what doesn't fit. But I think it's also important that this level of vulnerability and like trying things on doesn't have to be the same thing as just indiscriminate emotional investment. Because sometimes we end up romanticizing the idea of, oh, if I give everything, or if I change who I am, or if I just shift a little bit to fit into what this person wants, then, we're showing up in relationship in the way that we should be. But if we're not careful, giving everything can mean that we are losing a sense of ourselves or a sense of our own identity. So we have to be really careful. How much of am I emotionally investing in myself in a way that still helps me feel whole and helps me grow? I think there's a really big difference between losing ourselves in a relationship or sacrificing ourselves in a relationship and trying things on to see how can I still remain true to myself and then also expand on who I am because this person that I'm with is helping me grow. There's a certain level of permeability and flexibility that exists when we're experiencing healthy love and healthy connections with other people. But then there's this kind of painful experience that we can encounter when we have emotionally invested and then not received any return on our emotional investment. You might be in a relationship where you are or have worked so hard to finally understand someone else's perspective and then not experience that same level of being understood by them in return. Or you can love someone so deeply and still not be loved by them the way you need to be loved. Or you can consistently show up for someone who never develops the capacity to show up for you. And I think this is where many people become trapped because they've invested so much emotionally that walking away feels even more painful than staying because maybe they feel like they're losing a part of themselves. Or something I hear all the time is something like, well, I've already invested 10 years of my life into this relationship or this friendship or this job. I can't leave now. And that sunken cost fallacy creeps in and keeps them stuck. And while the sunken cost fallacy certainly exists from maybe more of a psychodynamic existential perspective, clinically, I tend to conceptualize that as, okay, well, the relationship has become intertwined with this person's identity now. So it's not necessarily about, well, I've already invested 10 years of my life. I can't leave now. It's more, I don't know who I am outside of this relationship. And so it's more terrifying to leave and not know who I am than stay and know who I am in this relationship. There's usually lots of questions during this period where there's this reflection on emotional investment and if things will change. Questions like, okay, well, if I stop doing what I'm doing or if I leave, what does that say about all the time and emotional investment that I've already experienced? Or was this even worth it? Or, kind of what was it all for? But I think the most painful one that I hear all the time is, what if I leave and then they finally change or give the love I never got to someone else? And what's really present in this experience is this deep hope that someone who has repeatedly disappointed us or let us down might finally come around and be emotionally available and love us and treat us the way that we need to be loved and treated. So people with more anxious attachment patterns often maintain that level of hope after a relationship has become, incredibly painful because there's a level of uncertainty that is keeping that active attachment connection or attachment style rather activated. So there's this concept called intermittent reinforcement, which I did another episode on attachment a while back. It's been a while, but if this interests you, I would recommend you go listen to that. But because I talk about intermittent reinforcement at more length. But the gist of it is this concept is when there's this kind of like unpredictable cycle of closeness followed by distance, followed by closeness. So it's one of the kind of strongest, most powerful ways to maintain an unhealthy emotional attachment to somebody. There's been tons of research that has shown that rewards in this situation that are delivered on an unpredictable schedule are often more compelling and stronger than rewards that are delivered consistently and predictably rather. And I think in the episode I did a long time ago, if I'm remembering correctly, I compared this experience to gambling, to slot machines. You are rewarded on an unpredictable schedule. You never know, when you're going to hit a jackpot, for example. And that's why the whole experience of gambling keeps people addicted and coming back, because you don't know, maybe this will be the time. And that happens in these types of relationship styles as well. We continue investing because our nervous system learns that, okay, well, we've experienced love and closeness from this person before. Maybe this will be the time that it just stays longer. Maybe this will be the time that it's changed forever. It gets even more complicated when, let's say, you leave a situation where someone wasn't able to show up for you the way that you needed them to show up, and they end up becoming more emotionally available for someone else. The experience of that is so much stronger and deeper than just grief and sadness. Suddenly this person is saying or thinking, oh, see, I told you so. Now there's evidence. They were capable. It's me that was the problem. I just wasn't enough. I wasn't lovable enough. Or they could have loved me the way I needed to be loved, but they just chose not to. So it's a problem with me. And you can see how quickly someone else's behavior then becomes evidence about our own worth. And we have to be careful with this, because this type of thinking is assuming that another person's capacity for emotional connection or attachment is fixed and kind of predetermined across all relationships throughout their entire life. But the reality is people do change, which I think is where this can get so complicated. Because yes, people can change, and people are like, why aren't they changing for me? But there are lots of reasons and situations that need to happen for people to change. Like, for example, therapy changes people, loss changes people, aging changes us, different relationships, different friendships, different jobs, different romantic connections. They all bring up and evoke different parts of ourselves. Timing matters, just readiness. Motivation is another big one. Motivation matters. Sometimes people become healthier and more emotionally available or emotionally regulated years after a specific relationship ends. But that's not an indication that that former partner was not worthy or valuable or good enough. But because growth often happens through loss, consequence, and life experiences, all of those together have allowed this other person to grow and change, ideally. And sometimes those experiences can't happen when we're repeating the same cycle with the same person or same job or same idea over and over and over again. So even if someone does eventually become the partner that you needed or that you wanted or that you begged for, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were withholding that version of themselves from you. It may just mean they hadn't developed the ability or the capacity to be that person. But that's still fucking painful. And I just want to acknowledge that. It's such a difficult experience to go through. Believe me. But the reality is, if you stay in these relationships, these friendships, these dynamics, because you're afraid someday someone else might receive what you never did, you have now decided to build your life around some sort of hypothetical situation rather than a reality. And I think a beneficial question here is, what has this relationship required me to sacrifice while I wait for something that might not happen? Because usually instead we're asking questions like, well, when will they change? Will they change? But regardless of what happens years from now, like your life is happening right now and your emotional needs still exist right now. And your capacity to love and receive love still deserves to exist in relationships that are available to provide that to you in the present moment. Okay, so I think it's time to pull some cards. And I think it's appropriate to bring parts work into this discussion. I do think underlying all of the attachment work and psychodynamic explorations so far, there is the reality that we bring all kinds of different parts of us into relationships. So I think that that's where our spread should go today. So let's do a 3-card spread. I think this is just going to be a general pull. I'm not reading for the collective. I'm not reading for you. I'm not reading for me. I think that this is just for you to be able to see how I would read these cards therapeutically. So I encourage you to actually pull alongside me so that you can have your own personal experience with the cards. So card 1 is, what part of me is trying to heal in this relationship? So I'm using my usual tarot vintage. And the question is, what part of me is trying to heal in this relationship? We have the 6 of Pentacles. This card's actually been coming up for me quite a bit lately. So thinking about the 6 of Pentacles and the part of me that's trying to heal in this relationship, I think our first inclination would be to explore this card through its traditional interpretation, which is, generosity, giving, reciprocity, which actually, now that I think about it, this card is actually really funny and apt for this discussion, talking about emotional investment and giving and taking. But I don't want to go in that direction because I've already exhausted that on this episode. I think a more therapeutic approach to this card would be viewing it through the lens of worthiness. So from a healthy perspective, we could look at the 6 of Pentacles as representing, a healthy flow of love and care and value, insert need here from one person to another. And especially, when you're growing up, you learn what healthy attachment looks like, what healthy give and take looks like, what care, attention, comfort, being protected, being emotionally in tuned and tended to. All of that stuff is kind of, flowing within these healthy relationship dynamics. But when those experiences are inconsistent, we tend to arrive at maybe a different understanding about what give and take is. In this case, with the 6 of Pentacles, that narrative might be, well, maybe love or emotional investment is something I'm supposed to provide, I'm supposed to give, instead of something I'm supposed to receive. And then this is where over time, like I mentioned earlier, these narratives kind of become a part of your identity. So in this case of the 6 of Pentacles, you're the one who notices everybody else's needs. You're the one anticipating, you're regulating everyone's emotions. You're the one who's putting in all the effort to make the relationship work. You're standing there like doling out these pentacles, these coins, saying, I'm doing all the things. It reminds me of, and it's funny because like, I am not a movie reference person. I envy people who are able to make those references so easily. My brain does not work that way. But there are a few films that stick with me. References do come up. And for some reason, it's probably because I've seen this movie a million times. Forgetting Sarah Marshall, there's a scene where the main character, or one of the main characters, Sarah Marshall, is, lamenting about how she's put so much effort into this relationship. And she's like, I did all the therapy. I read all the books. I went to all the conferences. And her husband's just kind of standing there like deer in headlights. It kind of reminds me of that. You are the one doing all the things, but you're not getting anything in return. And when this is tied to your identity, from the outside, you just look like somebody who is so generous, someone who is so giving and so loving. And, you're the giver, but you've learned that your worth and your value comes from being this kind of like indispensable and never ending well of care and attention. This makes me think a while back, I also did an episode where I explored Winnicott's theory of transitional objects. And there's also within his theory is this concept of the false self. And that might exist here where, there's this kind of self-identity organized around meeting the needs of others. And in that process, because we have solely identified with this meeting the needs of others, we are slowly losing our hold on our own sense of self. So in therapy, a question that would come up if someone was sitting in front of me with this experience would be, if you stopped giving, would you still be lovable? And I know that sounds rhetorical, but that's often a question that then unleashes, hours worth of processing. Okay, let's move on to card 2. So card 2 is, what is this part trying to protect me from or prevent from happening? And this part being the 6 of Pentacles. So what is that part trying to protect or prevent? All right, we have the Page of Cups reversed. So again, I don't intentionally read reversals, but sometimes I like to place the emphasis on what this might mean from a reverse standpoint. I feel like keeping it reversed here is actually pretty fitting. Pages typically represent, curiosity, beginnings, this kind of like exciting time of not having all the answers. And in this case, when it's also like from an age perspective, a young child or adolescent, or if we're thinking about this, psychotherapeutically, our internal child, our inner child. So the part that is constantly giving, I think, is protecting us, or this general reading, or protecting our inner child from re-experiencing the pain of having needs and then not consistently getting them met, or not being seen as valuable unless you were giving. And so the part that is giving says, I need to keep doing this, because if I don't keep doing this, then I'll be forgotten, I'll be discarded, I won't be important, I won't be loved. So that part is engaging in that behavior to avoid the pain or the fear of abandonment. And if we were to take this even deeper, there's a core fear that exists here, especially in this reverse Page of Cups, and that's loneliness. All right, let's move to card 3. So card 3 is, what does that part need outside of this relationship? So what does that part need beyond whatever relationship this is? And we have, that's lovely, the 2 of Wands. This is one of my favorite cards. This card feels like maybe the most expansive card in the deck, at least to me. I think it speaks to possibility. I'm someone who values thinking of what's possible. And I think this card is a reminder that there's so much more that exists beyond this little bubble that our life is. And this can also be an identity card, for someone whose life has revolved around this 6 of Pentacles part of, having to be a giver or having to earn love. I think the 2 of Wands kind of comes in with a radical perspective. And because I'm someone who experiences the cards as asking me questions all the time, often when I'm reading or I'm explaining cards to folks, I have to remind myself to not immediately ask a question, because that's what my brain naturally does. But I think in this case, it's important, because I think the 2 of Wands is asking us a question. I think it's asking us, who could we become? How could our identity expand if we were not limited to or solely organized around this idea or identity of being needed. Or you could extend that to be like, or this relationship. I think it's really sweet that the Two of Wands came up too, because I like looking at this card as the card of differentiation. And that seems to be kind of like a theme, especially when we're exploring attachment styles and relationship dynamics. And I think especially because this is a 2 card, this differentiation concept is super strong here, because it's saying, how can you experience yourself beyond this relationship? Or how can you make sure that your identity is not just contingent upon someone else's capacity to love you back or care about you? I think briefly summed up, these cards are saying, or even asking rather, what could be possible if I allowed all parts of me to coexist and not just the part of me that is trying desperately to be loved in this one specific relationship. So really, this whole spread or even this discussion is highlighting how the goal is to move from our attachment being solely connected to or organized around some past emotional wound that needs to be repaired, and instead organized around the possibility of who we could become if we let ourselves explore different identities. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.